In September of 2009, a man named Dale Cutter drove his wool buyer's truck down a gravel lane in Garfield County, Oklahoma, parked in front of a weathered barn, and told Nora Vass that her sheep were an embarrassment to the county. He said it the way men with clipboards say things they believe are kindnesses. He held his tablet at chest height and scrolled through a regional price sheet without looking up. The going rate for conventional commercial fleece that fall was 62 cents a pound. Dale said her clip would be lucky to fetch 50, given the condition of the animals. He called the flock a hobby, which was not a neutral word in Garfield County in 2009, and he said it twice so she would understand what he meant by it. Nora was 30 years old. Her husband, Ray, had been dead for 7 months. She was behind on the land note, behind on the truck, behind on the electric bill, and she had a 200-acre grass farm carrying 41 Rambouillet Cross ewes that a man with a county extension certificate was now calling a hobby, while her dog, Biscuit, watched from the barn door. Dale flipped to a new screen. He told her that if she wanted to make any real money in sheep, she would need to move toward a commercial composite breed, pull the old bloodlines, and scale up to at least 300 head. He said the word scalable. He said it with the ease of a man who had never paid a land note. She did not argue. She said, "I'll think on it," which was what Ray used to say when he had already decided. Dale drove back out the gravel lane. Biscuit watched him go. 5 years later, in October of 2014, a senior buyer for a specialty textile house in Tulsa sat in that same barn and wrote Nora a check for $31 a pound for 212 pounds of raw fleece. That number did not make sense by the logic Dale Cutter had carried onto her property, which is exactly why it needs explaining from the beginning. Let me tell you what Rambouillet wool actually is and why it mattered in that barn. The Rambouillet is an old breed. The French developed it from Spanish merino stock in the late 18th century, and it came to the American West in the early 20th by way of Basque and German sheepmen, who understood that the high plains and the dry rolling hill country demanded an animal that could carry exceptional fiber and survive country that would kill a soft sheep inside a hard winter, and do both at once. Nora's grandmother, Irene, had started the flock in 1961 with 6 ewes purchased from a ranch in the Texas Panhandle. Over 4 decades, she had selected for 2 traits above all else: a dense, fine crimped fleece in the low 20-micron range, and a constitution that did not require coddling. Micron count is the measure of a wool fiber's diameter. The lower the number, the finer the fiber, and the closer it sits against skin without itching. Commercial composite breeds, the kind Dale was recommending, run from 26 to 32 microns. They shear more pounds per animal, and that is the number that shows up clean and readable on a commodity ledger. What does not show up on that ledger is handle. Handle is the word textile people use for the way a fiber meets the hand, the kind of softness that is not slipperiness, but depth, a quality that comes from the geometry of the crimp and the density of the scales and the particular relationship between those two things that decades of careful selection can build into a bloodline, and that no spreadsheet has yet learned to name. Irene's journal was a green composition book with a cracked spine stored in a cedar chest in the farmhouse bedroom. She had recorded every lambing since 1963, every ram she had used and why she had chosen him, every fleece weight, and her handwritten note of whether the clip was coarser or finer than the year before. The journal was not a sentiment, it was a working document. Nora had grown up reading it the way other children read instruction manuals, And when Irene died in 2004, the cedar chest came to Nora and Ray as the only inheritance the estate had to offer. The estate had been modest. The land itself was encumbered by a note Irene had refinanced in 1998 to replace the barn roof, and the farmhouse had not been updated since the late 1980s. What the estate was not modest about, and what the probate attorney had no category for on any of his forms, was the breeding record in that green journal. No appraiser had ever been asked to put a dollar figure on 41 years of document selection toward a micron target. The attorney looked at the composition book and set it aside in the personal effects pile, between a wooden sewing box and a set of blue willow dishes. Nora put the dishes in a cabinet. She put the sewing box in a closet. The journal went into her hands and stayed there. Ray had been a quiet man who understood land the way Irene had understood fleece, through attention paid over years to the same system. He kept the flock going. He repaired the perimeter fence one stretch at a time through the years of their marriage, and he taught Nora which ewes to hold back from the sale barn and which rams would tighten the micron count without sacrificing birth weight in the lambs. He had also understood, in the way of practical men who never theorize about what they know, that the commodity market for wool was the wrong market for their animals. He had sold the spring clip 3 times at the sale barn in Enid, and 3 times come home with a check that did not justify the shearing cost. In 2007, he began selling directly to a small fiber co-op in Kansas, which was not a perfect arrangement but was a better one, and he told Nora that the problem was not the flock, but the category the market put it in. He died on the 14th of February, 2009, on a county road 6 miles from home, when a truck running a stop sign at 45 miles an hour met his pickup on the driver's side. He was 31 years old. There was no drama in the way the news arrived, only a knock at the door and a county deputy's face in the porch light, and then the particular silence that descends when the organizing principle of a life is suddenly absent. The weeks after were administrative in the way disasters always are. The truck note, the land note, the electric bill that had gone unpaid in January and was now carrying a late fee, the 41 ewes in the paddock who still needed hay twice a day, regardless of what had happened, because animals do not observe mourning periods. Biscuit understood that something was wrong. He stayed close to Nora's boots through those weeks, closer than he had before, and that small constancy was not a small thing, which is where things stood when Dale Cutter and his tablet arrived in September. If you have ever had someone call your life's work a hobby to your face, you know the particular quality of the silence that follows. It is not an angry silence. It is a reckoning silence, the kind where you measure the distance between what you know and what the credentialed world believes, and you decide whether to close that distance on their terms or to wait. Nora waited. The neighboring farm to her east belonged to a man named Carl Hopp, who had run cattle on 380 acres since his father passed in 2001. Carl was 44 years old in 2009, methodical and friendly, the kind of neighbor who brought a casserole when Ray died and then stayed for an hour to help move hay bales because there was work that needed doing. Carl had taken on considerable debt in 2007 to upgrade his operation, adding a new squeeze chute, a new flatbed truck, and a rotational grazing setup with temporary electric fencing. He moved on a schedule recommended by the county extension office. Carl and Nora compared notes over fence lines the way neighbors do. He told her in the spring of 2010 that a cattle buyer out of Enid had projected strong calf prices through 2012, and that he was looking at expanding his cow-calf numbers if the loan terms held. He thought Nora should consider running a few stockers alongside her sheep, get some returns on the back pasture she was leaving idle. He said it as a kindness. She thought about it for a full week and decided against it. Let me tell you what she was doing instead, because this is where the story leaves the commodity world behind entirely. In the winter of 2009, the month after Dale's visit, Nora spent 3 evenings with Irene's journal, spread on the kitchen table, a notepad beside it, and Biscuit asleep against her boots. She was trying to understand what her grandmother had been building. What she found was a 46-year record of selection pressure toward a single target, a micron count at or below 22, combined with a staple length of at least 3.5 inches, which is the floor for most hand-spinning and fine-weaving applications. Those two numbers together, sustained across a bloodline, produce a fleece that the commodity market cannot value correctly because the commodity market weighs pounds and prices per pound and has no category for depth of handle. The fiber arts world, however, has a very precise category for it. Nora had been spinning since she was 12. Irene had taught her on a drop spindle before she moved to the wheel, and she understood from the inside what a low-micron, long-staple Rambouillet fleece did in the hand differently from a commercial clip. She began carefully and without announcing it to anyone, to learn the vocabulary of the market that valued what her flock actually produced. She joined an online community of hand spinners and small-scale fiber artists in early 2010. It was not the kind of thing she would have done naturally, because she was not by temperament a person who sought out communities. She had sat with the arithmetic long enough to understand that the problem was not the fiber, the problem was the pipeline, and finding a different pipeline required knowing where it ran. She spent 3 months reading before she posted anything. She learned the vocabulary, which was denser and more specific than she had expected. Terms like loft, drape, yardage per ounce, long draw spinning, woolen versus worsted preparation. She learned which forum members were hobbyists and which were serious fiber workers who produced finished goods for sale, who taught workshops, who supplied small mills. She made a list of 20 people who seemed to understand quality at a working level. In the spring of 2010, she mailed out 12 sample fleeces from the spring clip, 4 ounces each, to people from that list. She asked only that they return an honest assessment of what they had received. She paid the postage herself, which ran to $46, which she did not have to spare. 8 of them wrote back. The language they used was consistent and specific. Exceptional crimp uniformity, outstanding handle for the grade, clean preparation, unusually fine staple for a farm direct clip. 2 of them asked what she wanted for a full fleece the following season. A third asked whether she had considered skirting to hand spinning standard rather than mill standard, because the fiber was worth the extra preparation time. She priced it at $14 a pound, which was more than 20 times what Dale had offered to pay, and she sold every fleece from the 2011 spring clip before the shearing was finished. She told no one except Biscuit, who kept the confidence without effort. This was also the period when her granddaughter, or rather the closest equivalent, arrived in the picture. Her niece, Lena, was 22 in 2011, finishing a degree in agricultural business at Oklahoma State. And she came out for a long weekend that May with the unconscious condescension of a young person who has recently learned the vocabulary of profitability. She walked the pasture with Nora and asked why the ewes looked the way they did, small and dense and a little unfashionable compared to the big-framed commercial breeds she had seen on farm visits for her program. Nora explained the micron target. Lena listened with the particular polite attention of someone reserving judgment. So you're essentially producing a boutique product, Lena said. I'm producing what these animals have always produced, Nora said. The market for it got lost for a while. Lena said that the gross revenue per animal was interesting, but the scale was too small to be viable long-term. She had absorbed the word viable the way her generation absorbed most words, from the air of a credentialed environment, and she deployed it with confidence. Nora did not argue the point. She asked Lena if she wanted to learn to skirt a fleece, which is the process of removing the edges and debris from a raw clip before it goes to a buyer. Lena said she probably should learn at some point. Now is fine, Nora said. There are moments that look like nothing when they happen. Lena, sitting on an overturned crate with a pair of skirting shears and a raw Rambouillet fleece spread across a slatted table, looked like exactly that. A teaching moment without consequence. What it actually was is harder to see from the outside. Nora showed her the borders first, the outer edges of the fleece that collected the most vegetable matter and the heaviest lanolin, and explained why removing them cleanly mattered to a hand spinner more than it mattered to a mill, which could process a rougher clip through its machinery. She showed her how to read the staple, pulling a lock free and measuring the length against her palm, and explained what the crimp density in that lock said about the fineness of the fiber. She showed her the difference between two used clips pulled from different sacks, one from an animal Irene had favored and one from a younger ewe Nora was not yet certain about, and she asked Lena to feel both of them without telling her which was which. Lena felt both samples for a long time without speaking. This one, she said, holding up the clip from Irene's favorite line. She was not sure why. She just knew. Nora nodded and did not say anything more about it. Some things explain themselves if you let them. Meanwhile, in 2012, Carl Hopp expanded his cow-calf herd by 40 head, taking on another $48,000 in operating debt at a variable rate that his banker at the time described as historically reasonable. The calf market held through the summer. Carl was not imprudent, and he was not unlucky in any simple sense. He was doing what the numbers recommended. Nora was buying a used fiber picker for $300 and teaching herself the mechanics of preparing fleece for direct sale to small mills. The divergence was invisible from the road. The spring clip of 2012 went to 23 buyers, spread across 8 states, at an average of $17 a pound. Nora's gross on that clip was slightly over $4,800. Against the land note and the electric bill and the feed costs, it was not wealth. It was survival with a margin. The margin was what mattered. Dale Cutter came back in the fall of 2012, not to her farm, but to the Garfield County Sheep and Wool meeting at the fairgrounds in Enid. He stood at the front of the room in his extension polo and talked about the declining returns in specialty wool and the structural advantages of composite breed programs for the mid-tier producer. There were 14 producers in the room. Nora was in the back row with a yellow legal pad. Dale's presentation was thorough and well-organized, the way his presentations always were. He had charts on a laptop connected to a projector, and the charts showed commodity clip prices over the preceding decade, alongside input costs per head for various breed systems. He was not wrong about any of the numbers he cited. He was correct that commodity Rambouillet clips were fetching less per pound than composite clips at the Enid sale barn. He was correct that the mid-tier producer running fewer than 200 head was unlikely to turn a profit on commercial wool alone. He presented this evidence with the patient authority of a person who had done the arithmetic and followed it to its only logical conclusion. The conclusion was that the specialty Rambouillet operation was a hobby. He said at that time in the context of a slide showing the cost per pound differential, and he said it with a kind of generosity, as though releasing producers from an unprofitable attachment. Several people in the room nodded. One man near the front said that he had been thinking along those lines himself. Nora wrote down the commodity prices Dale cited, then wrote down her own 2012 average in the margin beside them, and then divided one by the other. She was not performing an argument. She was just keeping accurate records of the distance between two worlds. The number was 900%. She capped her pen and listened to the rest of the presentation. She kept that number to herself for 2 more years. If you have ever watched something you love dismissed in a public room, you understand the particular patience that follows. It is not the patience of someone who has accepted the verdict. It is the patience of someone who is waiting for the evidence to arrive in a form that cannot be argued with. The evidence arrived in the summer of 2014, though it was dressed first in catastrophe. The drought that moved across the southern plains in the summer of 2014 was not as severe as the 2011 drought, which had been historic, but it arrived later in the season, and it caught the pasture-dependent operations at a bad moment. Carl Hopp's Bermuda grass pastures, which had been carrying more head than a dry year could support, began failing in July. He had to begin buying hay in August at prices that ran against a season when his operating debt was already extended. By September, he had sold 43 head to reduce his carrying costs, and those head went at market prices that were lower than his cost per pound basis, because the regional market was thin and everyone in the county was trying to move cattle at the same time. The drought did not break Carl. He was a careful man, and he had margins. But the margins were thinner than his projections had allowed for, and the variable rate note had ticked up twice since 2012. He told Nora over the fence in October that it had been a hard year. He said it with the flattened tone of a man accounting for loss without dramatizing it, which was the dignified way men in that county talked about hard years. She said she was sorry, and she meant it, because Carl was a good neighbor, and what had happened to him was not fair in any simple sense. It was fair in a harder sense, the sense that applies to the relationship between a specific system and a specific kind of stress, and she did not say that part aloud. His net loss for the season, after hay costs and the reduced price sale of the 43 head, ran to just under $22,000. Against his operating debt, it was not ruinous, but it was the kind of shortfall that changes the relationship between a farmer and his margin for the years that follow. Carl would recover. He was a capable man, and the land was sound. The version of his operation that had looked solid in 2013 looked different in October of 2014. And the difference was a dry summer arriving at a moment his system had been calibrated for the average. Her own summer had been different. Nora's Rambouillets carried less body weight per animal than Carl's cattle and required proportionally less grass. Her paddock rotation was light and flexible, built around the carrying capacity of the ground at its worst rather than its average. When the pasture tightened in July, she reduced her supplemental grain not by eliminating it, but by substituting hay she had purchased in the spring at pre-drought prices, a habit Irene had kept and recorded in the Green Journal as a note from 1980, buy winter feed in June and not October. She had purchased 300 bales in May. The price had been $4.80 a bale. By August, it was $8.20 and climbing. The flock came through the drought dry season at full fleece weight. She lost no animals. Her input costs rose by less than $400 for the season, which was approximately the price of 2 new tires on a flatbed truck, and far less than the cost of carrying more animals than the ground could support into a hard July. The fleece was what it had always been. In September of 2014, a woman named Ruth Ellison drove out from Tulsa. Ruth was the senior buyer for a textile house that sourced raw fleece for a small batch production line supplying upmarket knitwear makers in New York and London. She had found Nora through a spinner in Santa Fe who had been buying her fleeces since 2011 and had mentioned the Garfield County source to Ruth at a fiber festival. Ruth had emailed with 2 short questions and then proposed a visit. She drove out in a gray sedan on a Tuesday morning. She was 58 years old, had been buying fiber for 30 years, and she did not negotiate on principle. That last quality was not arrogance. It was the practical position of a person who had learned that the producers worth doing business with already knew what their fiber was worth, and that the process of negotiation was mostly a tax on their time and an insult to their knowledge. She walked the paddocks first, without saying much, looking at the ewes from a few feet away, noting the way the fleece sat on their backs, the density of the cover across the shoulders and the top line. She asked Nora 2 questions about the lambing schedule, and one about the shearing contractor she used. Then they went to the barn, where Nora had 2 skirted fleeces from the spring clip laid out on the slatted table. Ruth picked up the first one and held a lock to the light in the open barn doorway for a long time, turning it slowly. She did not speak. She set it down and picked up a second lock from a different part of the fleece and did the same thing. Then she worked her way through the second fleece, methodically, in the same silence. She set it down and asked her one question. How long have these animals been bred to this standard? Nora told her about Irene. She brought out the green journal. Ruth sat on the overturned crate Lena had used 3 years earlier and turned the pages slowly, not reading the details, but looking at the structure, the consistent columns, the unbroken annual record from 1963 to 2004. The notations beside each year's fleece weight that read finer or coarser or holding or 1 year in 1987, best yet, and a small underline. The evidence of sustained intention across 41 years. She closed the journal and set it on the barn board. This is what consistency looks like, Ruth said. I don't see this often. She offered $31 a pound for the entire spring clip, contracted 1 year forward, with a right of first refusal on subsequent seasons. Nora said she would take it. They shook hands across the barn board, and Biscuit got up from the corner and walked over and sat down at Nora's boot, which was where he always went when something settled. The check came to $6,572 for 212 pounds of raw fleece. That number does not look the same twice. The first time you read it, it is a revenue figure. The second time you understand that Dale Cutter's floor price, the 50 cents a pound he had quoted 5 years earlier, would have produced $106 for the same clip. The difference between those 2 numbers is not luck and it is not sentiment. It is the distance between a system that knows how to measure one thing and a system built over half a century to produce something unmeasurable until the right buyer arrives. $6,572. The room was quiet for a moment after Ruth wrote the number, and Nora looked at the barn wall and did not say anything for a while. Lena, who had driven down from Stillwater for the meeting because Nora had told her only that someone was coming to look at the flock, stood in the barn doorway and watched. She had been working at an agricultural consulting firm for 18 months. She had a good eye for numbers. She looked at the check and looked at her aunt and did not say the obvious thing because it was one of those moments when the obvious thing is not the right thing. Ruth left before noon. Lena stayed. She had been quiet since the check was written. She had the look of a person rearranging a structure she had built carefully and now needed to rebuild from different materials. The consulting firm she worked for dealt in commodity-scale agriculture, in efficiency metrics and input cost optimization, and the kind of analysis that produced a clean ratio at the bottom of a spreadsheet. The ratio at the bottom of this particular spreadsheet was not clean. It was $31 against 50 cents, and she had spent the better part of 3 years in an environment that would have told her the 50-cent number was the real one. They went through the green journal together that afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table under the hanging lamp. Nora made coffee and set the journal between them, and they went through it year by year, not quickly. Lena asked questions she had not known she needed to ask 2 years earlier. She asked about the selection protocol, the specific criteria Irene had applied when choosing a ram for a given season, whether it was always about tightening the micron or whether other traits had competed for priority. Nora explained that Irene had held 3 things in tension: the micron target, the staple-length floor, and what she called constitution, by which she meant the general vigor and hardiness of the animal, its resistance to foot rot, and its ability to hold condition on dry pasture. The commercial system selected for pounds of fiber, which was the one number it knew how to count. Irene selected for the relationship between 3 qualities over time, which was a harder problem and a slower one, but it produced an animal that could do all 3 things without sacrificing any one of them. Lena asked about crimp frequency and what its relationship was to handle. Nora pulled a lock from one of the sample bags and explained the geometry of it, the waves visible in the fiber under the barn light, how a higher crimp frequency in a given staple length generally corresponded to a finer, softer texture in the finished yarn, the way a tightly coiled spring has different properties than a loose one made of the same material. Lena held the lock and looked at it for a while. "I thought this was a hobby," she said. "It was not a defense. It was a statement of prior error, offered honestly, with the directness of a person who has been trained to examine bad assumptions once they are visible." "I know," Nora said. The following spring, Dale Cutter came to the Garfield County Sheep and Wool meeting again. Nora had arranged with the organizer to speak for 10 minutes at the end of the program about specialty fiber markets, not as an argument or a rebuttal, but as information for producers who might have animals suited to the market and not know it. She brought 2 pages of figures, including the commodity clip prices Dale had cited in 2012, her own price history from 2011 through 2014, a brief note on micron targets and what buyer categories corresponded to different ranges, and contact information for 2 textile buyer networks that sourced directly from farms. She did not mention Dale by name. She did not position herself against anything he had said in prior years. She presented the figures as information, plainly and in order, and she let the differential speak for itself. $31 per pound against 62 cents. The same fleece, the same sheep, the same Garfield County gravel road. 2 markets with 2 entirely different ways of measuring value. Dale sat in the 3rd row. He had a notepad on his knee, which was not unusual for him. He was quiet for the whole 10 minutes, which was slightly unusual, and he did not look down at the notepad while she was speaking. When she finished, he raised his hand. She had not expected that. "Where would a producer start," he said, "if they wanted to move in this direction?" He said it without any residual argument in his voice. It was a genuine question, asked by a person who had looked at two numbers and understood that his model had not been accounting for one of them. She told him about the breed associations that maintain micron testing records, the national registry where producers could submit fleece samples for objective grading, the textile buyer networks that sourced directly from farms, and the application process each of them used. She told him it was slow work because the specialty market required evidence of sustained quality across multiple seasons, and a single good clip from an untested source was not enough to establish a relationship with a serious buyer. The relationship required the kind of record that could only be built over time. He wrote it down. When the meeting broke up, he stopped her by the door and said that he had not understood what the Rambouillet line could be worth to a buyer who knew what they were looking for. "I know," she said, which was all she said. It was not a rebuke. She had meant it straightforwardly, the way one person tells another that they have heard them. Word gets around in a county the way water finds low ground, quietly, along the paths of least resistance, and then suddenly it is everywhere. By the following season, 3 producers in the county had contacted Ruth Ellison's firm with sample fleeces. Ruth tested 2 of them and found the micron counts too variable for her standard, somewhere in the 25 to 27 range, which was a respectable commercial clip, but not the fiber her buyers required. She told Nora that she had mentioned the source of the introduction, and Nora said that was fine. One of the 3 producers, a woman named Becky Strand, who ran 80 acres south of town and had kept a small mixed flock for most of her adult life, called Nora in November and asked if they could talk about the breeding program. She came out on a Saturday afternoon. Nora showed her the journal, walked her through the selection logic, explained the micron target and what it required in terms of ram choice and patience over multiple generations to move a flock's average in the right direction. It was not a quick process. Moving a commercial flock toward the 22 micron range, starting from 26, would take 5 to 7 years of disciplined selection, and there were no shortcuts through that timeline. Becky understood. She asked whether Nora had a ram she would consider selling. She sold her a ram named Grit for $800. Grit was from Irene's favored line, 2 generations removed from a ram Irene had purchased in 1991 from a rancher in the Texas Panhandle, and his fleece had come in at 21.4 microns in the 2013 clip. He was the right animal for what Becky needed, and Nora told her so plainly and explained what to look for in the first season's lambs to know whether he was working. She sold 2 more rams that winter. One went to a producer in the Texas Panhandle who had heard about the Garfield County clip from a spinner in New Mexico who had been buying Nora's fleeces since 2011, and one went to a young couple in the western part of the county who had recently taken over a family farm and were trying to find a market niche that did not require them to compete on commodity terms. She priced both animals the same as Grit. She wrote out 2 pages of notes for each buyer about the selection protocol, the things to watch for in the lambs, and where to send sample fleeces once they had 2 seasons of data. The land note was paid in full by March of 2016. Lena left the consulting firm in the fall of 2016 and came back to the farm. Not full-time at first, only on weekends, learning the shearing schedule and the paddock rotation and the lambing protocols that were annotated in a second green journal Nora had started keeping in 2009 in the same format as Irene's. By the spring of 2017, Lena was managing the buyer correspondence and learning to skirt and grade fleeces to Ruth's standard. She had a sharp eye and a willingness to do slow work, which are the 2 things the work requires. Nora did not expand the flock. She considered it and decided against it. The paddock system was calibrated for the number of animals the ground could carry without soil compaction and without the kind of rotational pressure that would erode the native grass stands her grandmother had managed since the early 1960s. More animals would have meant more risk, more debt, and a quality control problem she could not supervise by herself. She kept the flock at 48 ewes, which was 7 more than when Dale had parked his truck in the lane, and she continued selecting the way Irene had selected, one animal at a time, toward the number that mattered. Biscuit died in the spring of 2018 at the age of 12. He had been a border collie cross, black and white, with one brown eye and one eye that was pale and almost colorless. He had been at Nora's feet the morning Dale came, and he had been at her feet in the barn when Ruth wrote the check, and he was at her feet one more time when she buried him under the cedar tree behind the machine shed. Lena was there. Neither of them said much. Some things do not need to be said. The new dog's name was Flint, a border collie from a working line in the Texas Panhandle, picked up in the summer of 2018, who took to the flock inside of 2 weeks and sat by the barn door in the exact way Biscuit had. He was a smaller dog, darker, with a more restrained energy, but he had the same habit of settling at Nora's feet when the work of a day was finished. Animals know what the work requires, even when people are still learning. The green journal that sits on the kitchen shelf today has 2 handwritings in it. Irene's from 1963 to 2004. The columns in pencil, the notes in a cramped upright hand. Nora's from 2009 forward. The same columns, a different hand, and beginning in 2017, a third hand in the entries for the fall lambing, which is Lena's. Ruth Ellison's textile house renewed the contract for the 6th consecutive season in 2019. The price per pound had risen to $36 against a commodity market that was paying 68 cents. Nora declined an offer of outside investment from a fiber company in 2018. She declined a second offer in 2019. She is not building a brand. She is maintaining a standard. The distinction matters, and she knows it the way Irene knew it, in the bones rather than the vocabulary. There is a thing that happens when a market that was built to count one kind of value encounters a product built to carry a different kind entirely. The market does not know what to do with it at first. It assigns a low price because it has no other category. It sends an extension agent with a tablet and the word hobby, and the word lands the way such words always land, as a small damage intended as a help. The damage does not stop the work. It only means the work has to be done without the market's attention, in the quiet of a barn and a kitchen table, and a journal that has been recording evidence since before the agent was born. When the right buyer finally arrives, they do not need convincing. They hold the fiber to the light and ask one question about how long the standard has been kept, and the answer to that question is the entire argument. What a system can measure and what is truly valuable are almost never the same thing. They sometimes overlap, but the overlap is accidental. The commodity market measured pounds. The fiber market measured microns. Neither of them measured what Irene had spent 41 years building, which was a bloodlines relationship to one particular piece of Oklahoma ground, calibrated year by year until the animals and the land and the climate and the selection pressure had reached a kind of equilibrium that could not be replicated quickly and could not be bought outright and could only be inherited, tended, and passed forward to a hand that was willing to do the slow work. What is rigid breaks when the pressure changes. What is attentive and adaptive and rooted to a particular place survives, and more than survives, it becomes legible at last to the people who have the equipment to read it. The fleece speaks for itself. That is what the journal was always for.